So last spring, we had the joy of celebrating Alvin Richter's 90th birthday. Alvin, can you raise your hand? For those of you who haven't had the pleasure of meeting him yet, has been a member here since 1957, for 67 years. He arrived here as a German immigrant after World War II. He had been sponsored by a family that then fell through literally while he was in the air from Germany to JFK. But he was redirected to Union Kong after a frantic phone call from Church World Service found a receptive pastor and congregation here. They helped him find housing, connect with work, welcomed him in with a cup of coffee, and an invitation to not just be served, but also to serve. He quickly volunteered to be an usher, although with his little limited English, he jokes that he mostly said the same thing over and over. Sitting with him recently, he fondly recalled Christmas Eve services, standing in the back as an usher, looking out those tower doors and watching finely dressed young mothers holding the hand of their young children coming up the walk. Or sitting where you are, gazing over the heads of the folks in front of you in the pews up at these windows behind me. Mostly, Alvin talks about the people, about how they introduced him to a different world and a different way of being, a way of being that was generous and service-oriented, perhaps easier to do from the lives of relative privilege than the one that he came from, but transformative nonetheless. Alvin told me that the church has made him who he is, has changed how he shows up in the world. It has changed his life. At 90, Alvin still wakes up every morning and asks how he might be able to help someone else today. The church has stayed by his side from that first night in a new country, through the death of his wife, his beloved wife, and later his son, and recently stood by him as he has been recovering from a fall, and it is wonderful to see him back in church this morning. It's a marvel now that we are all here. As it turns out, Jesus knew a thing or two about what it would take to stick it out, to weather the ups and downs of discipleship, of what it would take to be the church from generation to generation. Let's start with that first question that Jesus posed. Who do they say that I am? Who do you say that I am? Here at Union Kong and in the United Church of Christ, as a non-creedal denomination, we not only acknowledge that there are as many different nuanced understandings of Christ as there are congregants, and maybe even more, but we celebrate it. We in the UCC often have found a home here after leaving another tradition. So I'm curious, how many of those among us this morning are lifelong UCC folks? Can you raise your hands? Good smattering, all right. And how many of you were raised in or are coming from another background? Like how many of you have coming from the Catholic Church? About the same amount. Evangelical or charismatic settings? Again, another similar amount. Presbyterians? How about Episcopalians? A couple. Jewish? A couple. Secular homes? Interesting, that's in the minority. Are those of you who what did you say, Lutheran? Yes, Lutherans represent. Sorry, didn't mean to leave the Lutherans out. Others that I have left unnamed, RCA or CRC, yes, Reformed churches. Any others? Disciples? Methodists. What'd you say, Sally? Methodists. Any Baptists? A couple Baptists, all right. So, clearly, we each bring our religious baggage. The good, the bad, and the complicated along with us. And whether we ever even say it out loud, this shapes us. Of course, it isn't just religious background, but all of our other identities and experiences that also come with us when we show up in church. Our race, nationality, class, age, sexuality, gender, our educational experiences, our regional differences, our work experiences, our relationships, and our family experiences. And Jesus teaches us an important lesson. Before jumping ahead and asking people to get on board with what will be a difficult task, we might do well to pause and ask one another, maybe not always, who do you say that Jesus is, but who do you bring with you here? What experiences are you drawing on to shape your perspective on this? To draw one another out, to begin to encounter one another with curiosity, that it might move us towards understanding. So if the first step of building the beloved community, as I preached last week, was showing up, the second step might be engaging one another with curiosity. We all know that when strangers meet, there's a fairly standard ritual followed as we seek to get acquainted. It begins with names, and I'm very glad to see so many of you wearing name tags this morning. There's blank ones on the back as you make your way to coffee hour if you don't have one. And then in the church are sort of standard coffee hour questions. Oh, where do you live? How'd you find out about the church? What's your faith background? Do you work or what do you do? What are your interests? Are you from around here? Where did you grow up? A stranger turns into an acquaintance, and we get a sense of who the other person is as we gain their context. But as the relationship develops, there are other deeper insights to be gained. And I think that the threshold, when someone turns from an acquaintance into a friend, or from a visitor to a member, from a sense of being welcomed to a sense of belonging, is when we become vulnerable with one another. And we become vulnerable when we are open about suffering or shame. I think that, in fact, the glue in a relationship, whether at church or in our personal lives, is witnessing someone stand by us even when it is hard. And maybe that's some of what Jesus was getting at when he spoke so frankly about the suffering ahead. Discipleship is about showing up not only when times are good, but more importantly, when they are not. In marriage, the couple vows to support one another in sickness and health, in plenty and in want, in joy and in sorrow. It is this spirit of covenant that animates our life together as a church. And I think the folks that have been around here 40 years or more, and many of the rest of us, have lived that. The church has stood by you in times of trial, and you have weathered the storms of congregational life. You have showed up for others, and they have showed up for you. Martin Luther King, the one who, of course, developed this idea of beloved community, recounted a moment where he had glimpsed it. After the march to Montgomery in the spring of 1966, several thousand marchers were delayed at the airport because their planes were late. As King tells it, he was deeply impressed by the heterogeneity, yet the obvious unity of the crowd. He said, "As I stood with them and saw white and black, nuns and priests, ministers and rabbis, labor organizers, lawyers, doctors, housemaids, and shopkeepers, brimming with vitality and enjoying a rare comradeship, I knew I was seeing a microcosm of the humankind of the future in this moment of luminous and genuine brotherhood." What a contrast there is between a bunch of different people in an airport, jostling to be first in line, elbowing for a little storage space, or ignoring one another entirely, and a bunch of different people in an airport who have sacrificed something to show up, and are willing to tolerate inconvenience, suffering, discomfort, and persecution because they believe in the power of standing side by side and the righteousness of their cause. Over the last few weeks, as I was preparing this service to honor our longtime members, I asked a few people, those of you who have sojourned with this church for more than 40 years, why do you stay? What's made you stick it out? And if there's one thing that I heard consistently about why you are still here and why the rest of us show up, it's because of those relationships. Because of the community. Now, in a span of 40 years in any church, you will see heartache, disappointment, conflict, and plenty of times of sorrow. What sees us through is one another, the sense that through it all you are not alone. And on the one hand, it is easy to say that, but quite another to live it. I truly think to live it begins to get at what Jesus means by losing one's own life. As one commentator wrote, modern readers tend to read this call to discipleship as an individual call, but we would do well to consider the communal aspect of it, aspect of life in the ancient world. And perhaps the call is to deny self for the well-being of community, to take up one's cross on behalf of the beloved community, to follow God with the community. Perhaps the folks who have made it this long have learned how to let their personal preferences take a back seat to the prevailing consensus, have learned how to let disagreements be just that and nothing more, have had some practice at the ebb and flow of serving and being served, of leading and following. In a time of cancel culture, and more broadly, a general distrust of institutions, a readiness to jump ship rather than weather the storm, I lift up your examples. And I lift up the possibilities that these give us too. Because what Jesus promises is that when we give up just a bit of our ego, we gain just a bit of beloved community. When we let go of self, we might gain just a little slice of the kingdom of heaven. A little later in the service, we're going to celebrate all of the ways that each of you is the church, the ways that we together do the ministry and the work of the church. From the governing board to standing committees to ministry teams, small groups of all kinds, those that welcome people on Sunday morning or sit up here and sing, to those whose work is behind the scenes. And I wonder what might happen if we saw our purpose, not just as those roles and tasks in and of themselves, but the relationships that are formed in the process. To look around and realize that even as we work to transform our wider community, we are being transformed. So we celebrate this morning those of you who have sojourned with this community for the long haul. We continue to journey together and follow in the footsteps of those who came before. We are the church, serving and being served, transforming and being transformed, building the beloved community, being the church, will require curiosity, commitment, and an appreciation for the process as much as the product. May it be so.